Good evening. If you will, turn to Luke chapter 15. I have been looking forward to finishing the lesson from this morning as we look at the parable of the two sons. As I mentioned this morning, this is often called the parable of the prodigal son, and rightly so. The majority of the parable is dedicated to the youngest son of the father. But he had an oldest son. The older brother is mentioned at the end of the parable, and oftentimes is really not mentioned, especially in the heading, the fact that it's only given to the prodigal son. But when we look at the context of who's being written to, we see that it was actually the oldest son who they needed to hear about. And it's the oldest son that we need to hear about as well. So as we look at verses 11 through 32, we're going to gather what is truly important for us today. And so, as we saw this morning, that the prodigal son, he showed he had rebellion from verse 11 through 24, that his rebellion led him away from the Father, which caused humiliation, which caused hunger, and he experienced heartlessness and homesickness that led him to come to his senses, so that he would come to himself and then come to the Father. That caused repentance, caused him to get up out of that wallowing in the mire and walk toward the Father. But if you'll recall, verse 20 says, "And he arose and came to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt," the first thing is compassion. So his heart went out to him, and then his feet followed suit as he ran. I mentioned that this morning. And he embraced him. His arms then were thrown around his son, and then he kissed him. You see this embrace, you see this precious response from a father that has been worried sick for his son. It shows his rejoicing over his son. And then we see the oldest son. We see the brother's response. His response to the rejoicing of the father. There's going to be 4 different R's that are mentioned from this one. First one, the unforgiving son, verses 25 through 32 is what I've entitled it in my Bible. Because his first response to the rejoicing of the father was rage. Rage. Maybe that is too harsh of a word. It started with the letter R. So I wanted to have that in there for consistency. But what we see within the passage is, let's look at verse 25. It says, "Now his older son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf, because he's received him back safe and sound, but he was angry.'" But he was angry. Remember where he is as far as the celebration is concerned. He's on the outside of the house. Almost maybe if you think he hears the singing, he sees the dancing, you almost see him looking through a window. And he is watching this going on. And what is the result? He's angry. He's enraged at this celebration because of his brother, because of the father's rejoicing. He's indignant. How dare he come back? How dare he show his face again? And how dare my father kill the fattened calf? Why is there celebration going on? Well, this is not the first time that this is the response to the rejoicing of the father over the son. If you will, turn to Genesis chapter 4. This is not, we can't apply this like apples to apples, but there is some incredible connections to Cain and Abel. If you look at verses 3 through 7, it says, "In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. And Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering. But for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry." So Cain felt rage over the rejoicing of the father, much like this oldest son, who had rage over the rejoicing of his father. But Cain and his offering had no regard, so Cain was very angry, and his face fell. But the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry, and why is your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? If you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it." I believe that this oldest son, a part of the parable, that sin is crouching at the door because he's not entering into that door. He's on the outside looking in, and rage is ensuing. Well, in the second place, we have a refusal. If you'll turn back to Luke 15. He is not just angry, not just showing rage, but that's why I say sin is at the door, because he's refusing to go in. Now, notice it says, but he was very angry and refused to go in, the second part of verse 28. Now, it's important that we recognize the audience of this parable. We've got to go back to verses 1 through 2 of chapter 15. It says, "Now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to Jesus. And the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, 'This man receives sinners and eats with them.'" And verse 3 says, "So he told them this parable." And then he goes and he tells 3 parables that all relate to the same concept. Look at verse 4. "What man of you, having 100 sheep, if he has lost one of them, does not leave the 99 in the open country and go after the one that is lost until he finds it?" You think about the father who saw his son at a far distance. Well, how did he see him? Because he was looking for him. It wasn't a random chance that he just happened to see him. He had been looking for him. Probably looking at the very spot where he disappeared on the horizon as he walked away from his father. His father sees him at that very spot, but he's facing a different direction, and he's looking a little bit more haggard. Sin has taken its toll on him, and so he made up the difference and ran to see him because he had compassion. So we see that the father is represented as a shepherd. But look at verse 8. "Or what woman, having 10 silver coins, if she loses one coin, does not light a lamp and sweep the house and seek diligently until she finds it? And when she's found it, she calls together her friends and neighbors, saying, 'Rejoice with me, for I found the coin that I lost.' Just so I tell you, there is joy before the angels of God over one sinner who repents." Notice the rejoicing that takes place over one who was lost and is found. Then he tells the parable of the prodigal son. He's telling it to an audience of Pharisees and scribes. The Pharisees, it meant those who were set apart. They set themselves apart. They saw themselves as different than any other Jew because they knew the law. And so they thought that they were the righteous, that they had arrived. And so it's important that they stuck their noses in the air concerning the audience that Jesus put himself around. Notice it was tax collectors and sinners. Tax collectors who were literally just the turncoats of their society. They were the ones that were exacting taxes on their own fellow Jews for the Romans that had conquered them. Sometimes we look at tax collector. This is more like a toll booth operator on the road as people would pass by. They would collect the taxes for Caesar. They were not appreciated in their society. They were outcasts, degenerate. And then also the sinners. They were the ones drawing near to hear Jesus. And it shows from the parables, the 3, that there's a celebration, that they're coming to Jesus. The only ones who are upset about this celebration are their brothers, the Pharisees and the scribes. The scribes, the ones who knew the law, who wrote it, who understood it, and yet they obviously missed something. They missed the mercy. They missed that concept of love. And so it's important to see when we see this rage and then refusal, that he is speaking concerning the Pharisees. Those who would consider themselves having arrived, consider themselves better than the prodigal son. So this has, yes, sometimes we can look at this and say, well, it's a story, it's a parable, but it's something that is paralleled. It goes along with an actual account that's taking place. The Pharisees are doing this very thing, and if we're not careful, we can do the same thing when our own prodigal son or daughter returns to the Lord. We can look at them and say, where have they been? We can look at them and have anger in our hearts concerning maybe what they've done to us or what we know that they've done. We can have a refusal to even join in on the celebration. What are the consequences of that taking place? Well, for us, or for those who would refuse and have rage, there's also going to be resentment. If you will, look at Luke 15 and verse 28 again. But he was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him. But he answered, But he answered his father, "Look, these many years I've served you, and I never disobeyed your command. Yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends." Remember, it was a fatted calf. A fatted calf in comparison to a young goat. Notice what he's saying here. He's saying, I never even got a measly little goat. You've given him the fattened calf. You know, this is a much bigger celebration than anything you've ever given me. And this isn't fair. There's resentment. You see the resentment. But notice he was angry. He refused to go in, but his father came to find him. The father came to find him. Do you see comparisons to the father seeking his youngest son? The father is seeking his oldest son here. And he comes out and entreats him, pleads with him to come inside. But this oldest son has resentment in his heart. So notice he's saying, I never left. He's saying, I'm the good son. I never left, and yet you didn't do this for me, showing this kind of resentment. Do we see that take place with Cain and Abel? Yes, we do. In Genesis chapter 4, if you'll turn there, in verse 6, the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? And why has your face fallen?" Think about the comparisons with the father of the prodigal and the father of the unforgiving son and our Father in heaven. Both were willing to leave a celebration to come and find the resentment, the brother who was full of rage and resentment. So here in Genesis chapter 4, God has left the celebration of Abel's sacrifice to find Cain. And so he says, "Why are you angry? Why is your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? If you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it." So he's entreating Cain to rule over this sin that's taken over his life. And it's important that the father in the parable has come to entreat his son to come inside. The fourth and final place is rejection. Rejection. The oldest son has rejected the father's rejoicing. If you will look at verse 30. It says, "But when this son of..." Well, I'll read verse 29. "But he answered his father, 'Look, these many years I have served you, and I never disobeyed your command. Yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him.'" Notice this son has no idea what his brother has actually done with that money. He sees him in a moment. But was he there when he went off into the far land, when he went off into the far country? It's amazing the amount of information that he knows of what his brother has done. He's extremely particular about what he's done. That he has devoured your property with prostitutes, and you killed the fattened calf for him. But notice it's not the father's property, it's also, he was living there. This was also a difficulty for him to lose a third of, and we mentioned this, and I make sure that for those who weren't here this morning, we mentioned that the property, when he comes to his father in 11 and 12 and says, give what's coming to me, we understand that this, based on Deuteronomy chapter 21, this is a third of his father's property to the youngest son. A third of it. And to take that property, then sell it, that should never have taken place. And then that, based on the law, and he sells it and he takes complete advantage of his father and his brother. So he's got a grudge that he's holding, which would cause him to reject the father's rejoicing. Well, what do we see in Genesis chapter 4 and verse 8? The father was willing to come outside of that celebration to find Cain and tell him, if you do right, will you not be accepted? And if you do well, sin is crouching. If you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. He gives him a choice to do right or do wrong. God allowed that to happen. And what did Cain choose? Look at verse 8. Cain spoke to Abel, his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. So he rejected the father's celebration, just like the son in the oldest son in the parable rejected the father's celebration. Well, what are the consequences? What are the consequences of rejecting the father's celebration? Well, look at verse 31 and 32 of Luke 15. And he said to him, Son, you always are with me, and all that is mine is yours. And it was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. The father explains himself. He explains why he's celebrating. Because he saw that his son was dead, but now he was alive. And that is cause for celebration. Because his son was willing to come to himself and say in his mind, he says, I'm going to go to my father and I'm going to tell him that I've sinned against heaven and against my father, against God. And he's saying, I'm no longer worthy to be your son. I'm going to be an indentured servant, and it just put me to work in the fields, and I will work for you for food. I will not be considered a son. But remember, because of the father feeling compassion, and then his heart going out to him, and then his legs following and him running out to him, because he was willing to then embrace him and kiss him, that shows the response from the father for someone who repents. Because why? He was willing to stand up and walk home. How many times do we have individuals who we've not seen in a very long time? Sometimes I don't have the luxury of that because I've only been here 2 years. And so when someone comes through these doors that maybe I've never met before, I'm going to immediately just talk to them, have no idea. So don't expect me to know. But maybe you'll see somebody that you've not seen in over a decade. How do we respond? How do you respond? I believe we have this mentality that someone has to repent by coming forward during an invitation. That's the only time that takes place. Now, that's a time. And we have evidence of that in Acts 2 and verse 40 with many other words. Peter entreated them, save yourselves from this crooked generation. And it was at the end of a sermon. And 3,000 responded on that day. So we have the biblical evidence for that. But we also have a time where we're to get right with God is when we examine ourselves, when we partake of the Lord's Supper every first day of the week. We make our life right with God when we do that. But sometimes we need to recognize as somebody who has not darkened the door of a building to be among the saints, to be apart with the church. When we see that take place, someone come back through those doors, do we take compassion on them? And if we have compassion, then our heart will go out to them and our legs will follow suit, and we'll get up from our seat and we'll walk over to them regardless We'll put our arms around them. We'll kiss them. Say, we're so thankful that you're here. If we respond in that way, that's what the Father does. That's what the Father is willing to do. But it was the brother who was saying, how can you celebrate? How can you do this? He has wasted the inheritance that you've given to him. You see this vault that's in this picture, this vault that represents that money. It's the only one I could find that, that kind of represents that concept of wealth and inheritance. He was willing to take his portion, his stack, and then he got rid of it and it was gone. And you almost think that, that's what he was looking for in his inheritance. It was earthly. But when he came to himself, he returned. How many people have come to themselves and they've returned? But they've been met with anger, resentment, refusal to go and meet with them, and rejection. Do you see why we have to see that this is a parable of the two sons? The responsibility of the family of God is to take care of its own, to reach out to those who have been lost, to be real, to strive to encourage others. And you realize if we reject the celebration of the Father, then we are in a state of rebellion. We're in a state of rebellion. The son who never left the pew, the sister who never left the pew, can be in a state of rebellion by not reaching out with open arms to those who would return, to those who have repented. So, wait a minute. We can rebel by never leaving. Yes, we can. Because think about who the audience is. It's those who saw themselves as set apart. Well, that's what saint means. We are to be set apart from the world, but not from those who repent, who are willing to come back to the Lord. Maybe we could look at somebody and say, well, you know what? I know what they did. I know how far they fell. And we would look at that person and say, well, if that's the case, then we've refused to let our heart go out to them. We've refused compassion. And maybe because of that, we then resent them, maybe resent those who would put their arms around them. Well, nobody's put their arm around me. Nobody's made a big deal about me. So often we can rebel in this way. And notice this is the exact slide for the prodigal son. We'd be no different. May we recognize, maybe we come to our senses just like Jesus was trying to do as He was teaching these three parables to the Pharisees and the scribes. He was trying to get them to see that they needed to show mercy for those who were coming back to the Lord. If we're willing to do this, then God will forgive others and He will forgive us for when we've taken our eyes off of the focus. And I think sometimes the only time we see someone coming through, and sometimes, please know, I'm not trying to say or interject a purpose that anybody has. I'm not trying to say that we don't do that here in Deerfoot. And so often, because of the two services that we have, sometimes we can even assume that someone's been at the other service and we just don't know. And so we got to recognize that those are some difficulties. I've mentioned this before. I remember I called someone one time and I said, hey, just wanted you to know, it was a Sunday afternoon. I said, I miss seeing you today. And he was like, I was there. And I said, oh, well, he was sitting in a different seat. And I missed him. He said, but thanks anyway. But I felt so embarrassed. I remember just feeling horrible because maybe if you haven't talked to someone in a while and you see that person say, hey, just hadn't seen you in a while. Just wanted you to know, love you. I'm here for you. Maybe even change up the time that you, because we also get into a habit of always coming to a specific service. We're missing quite a few people when we do that. And sometimes mixing it up, that can happen. That can help with reaching out to individuals. But what happens, I want you to think about the prodigal son that returns. He sees the father. The father comes and embraces him, and that's what we are going to strive to follow, right? That's the example we're striving to follow. But did he see the brother? He didn't know about any of this conversation going on with the father. All the prodigal son was experiencing was silence from his older brother. Think about it. He had nothing. He didn't know the rage was there. He didn't know the resentment was there. But it was silent. He's left to fill in the gaps, to fill in the blanks. So often when those who return and they hear nothing from anybody, they're left to fill in the blanks. And they could read rage. They could read resentment. Because think about where the prodigal son was. He came to his senses. And he recognized where he had been. He's going to know that other people know it too. And that's got to be the most vulnerable place that there can be for him to swallow his pride and return. Are we willing to swallow ours and put our arms around those who return? All I'm saying is reach out to those who maybe you've not seen for a while. And it may be that they've been at a different congregation. That happened to me recently. Had no clue. But I reached out to somebody. I'm so thankful to hear they were worshiping the Lord. May we recognize that we have a job to do. And may we all look around and see, is there someone that we can reach out to? Don't give up on them like the oldest brother did for his youngest brother. May we follow the example of the Lord as He had compassion and He was willing to run. He put His arms around him and kiss him. We have an invitation tonight. It is one of the times where we can make sure that our life is right with God and with the assembly. Because we understand that from Matthew chapter 18, that this is an opportunity. It's a time for us to speak to the church, to the assembly, an invitation to make sure that our life is not in a mire, but that we're willing to stand up and walk back home. If you need to come home tonight, don't hesitate. Come while together we stand and while we sing.